Everyone, get everyone to have a seat, please. Okay, Dr. Rosenberry, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to give you a brief update on deer and elk populations, as well as provide recommendations for elk and antlerless deer license recommendations for the upcoming hunting seasons this year. For the 2019-2020 elk seasons, the addition of archery and late antlerless seasons have been recommended. We are recommending a total of 15 licenses for the archery season, 98 licenses for the general season, and 29 antlerless licenses for the late antlerless season. And to evaluate success rates, wounding loss, and logistics of field checking elk, a limited number of licenses have been recommended for that archery season. And these license recommendations are sustainable with our current elk population. This year's elk license recommendations are similar to last year's. In zones 11 and 12, additional antlered licenses are recommended in response to some crop damage complaints that we are getting in those zones. That's a quick rundown of elk. Any questions on the elk license recommendations? All right. Our recommendations for the antlerless deer license allocations follow this defined process. It's a process that incorporates the goals of the Game Commission's deer management plan in a defined manner and that is supported by data. Biological data are collected by Game Commission staff from most bureaus in all regions. The forest data are collected by the U.S. Forest Service and analyzed by Bureau of Wildlife Habitat Management personnel. Under deer health, we look at results from our chronic wasting disease testing, fawn to doe ratios from the harvest, as well as our deer population trends. Under deer-human conflicts, we look at a survey of Pennsylvania residents and the results from that survey. And under forest health, we look at forest regeneration and deer impact data from both public and private land across Pennsylvania. Looking at deer populations, we see that our deer populations are sustainable at current harvest levels, with all of our populations as stable or increasing throughout Pennsylvania. On this slide, the dark green units, units 2F, 4C, and 5B are increasing in dark green, and the light green represents all the other units that are stable across the state. Forest regeneration is fair or good across Pennsylvania, but we do have some units with high deer impact. One of those units with good regeneration, 4A, it's unfortunate for that unit, but the presence of CWD overrides any benefit of having good regeneration in that unit in terms of our antlerless allocation recommendations. For 2F, regeneration is good, but most people consider the deer population about right or too high, so we are recommending a stable population in that unit. 3A has good regeneration, but in recent years we did reduce the allocation to allow the deer population to increase. The population has responded and increased in that unit. As a result, we're recommending stabilizing the deer population for a number of years at this higher level, and this will allow us to evaluate the effect of that higher deer population on forest regeneration in Unit 3A. And in Units 3B, 3C, 3D, and 4E, we are recommending higher antlerless allocations due to the high deer impact on forest regeneration in those units. To date, we've detected CWD infected free-ranging deer in 6 units, and they're indicated there in red: 2C, 2D, 2E, 4A, 4B, and 4D. There are 4 other units, 2F, 5A, 5B, and 5C in the southeast that overlap with a disease management area or DMA, and the DMAs are noted there in dark red. In the 6 units with infected free-ranging deer, we are recommending increased allocations to reduce deer populations. And based on our experience in Pennsylvania, CWD continues to increase at current deer population levels, thus our recommendation to reduce those deer numbers. And this slide shows a summary table of our deer population trend by unit, our deer plan objective, and recommended allocations to achieve the deer plan objective. With that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
So one of the things I think we need to stress is that when we talk about deer numbers, when regeneration is not great, it doesn't take many deer to continue to damage the growth. So it's not necessarily that we've got high numbers of deer, it's just that the forest is struggling to come back, and any amount of deer really is not good for that area.
What we're looking at with regeneration, if it's not good, we certainly don't want to add more deer to those units. Not saying that deer are the only thing affecting it, because there's a whole slew of other factors out there that can affect regeneration. We know deer are one of those, and that's the one that in this meeting we can control through the allocation process. So if we have an area that does not have good regeneration, that is not an area where we would be recommending increased deer number because of that potential for the increased impact of deer, given whatever circumstances exist within a particular unit.
Chris, as you said, with the CWD, we want to bring the populations down to a smaller level, and yet some places really you haven't bumped up the allocations by very much. I mean, I'm looking at 2C, you're saying go from 44 to 52, 2D 63 to 66, and 2E from 27 to 32 from I'm looking last year to this year. And I guess my question is, if we're really serious about a huge impact, 1,000, that's not going to do much for us.
I think some of that we would need to look back at last year's recommendations and what they were based on. So if last year, 2D, that was a unit that was increased last year with the same intent to reduce deer numbers. So this year, the difference there of 3,000, that's really just a matter of annual changes in how many tags or what the average harvest was, things like that. So that's essentially we're at the same position we were last year. We wanted to reduce deer numbers in 2D. This year we want to reduce deer numbers in 2D, and we're recommending a comparable allocation. For 2C, we're looking at a similar situation there. That allocation for last year was a recommendation to reduce those deer numbers as well, or to bump that up and stop that increase. So that's what you're seeing there is the decisions to have higher allocations. Some of those started last year, so this year is just a continuation. So there's not a big jump.
And I guess the other question that's related to that, so you look at like 2D, you had a map up there that showed, where the DMAs are, but 2D only had a very small portion that was in the DMA.
Right.
I think 4D and 5B, if I recall. And yet, I think you've increased the allocations for those whole units, and it makes me wonder if we don't need a more surgical approach than saying the entire DMA, and only a little piece of it is impacted right now.
Right, and that's been something that we've discussed over the last 5-6 years or 7 years since we've had CWD. The issue that we're looking at right now in 2D, you're correct. There's one positive animal up there in that northeast corner. 4D and 4B as well. They have a couple positives that we've found in the western part. The allocation itself, I would say that is more of a proactive approach because we do have it outside the fence in those areas, and that is a concern because we do have higher deer numbers in those particular units. So the allocation is a proactive approach to start reducing some of those numbers. In terms of the surgical, I think that's where the DMAP units, the CWD DMAP units come in. They are specific to areas where we have clusters of positives, and we want to have more of an impact in those particular areas. So all of this, the unit allocation always has been a broad brush, and the broad brush intent with those units that have positives in the wild is to proactively work numbers down from where they are, because in some of those units, 2D, for example, hunters are harvesting consistently 12 deer per square mile. That's the harvest. So there's a lot of animals that are being harvested in those units. And that's
that bump in 2D, that comes from a discussion that we had a couple years ago, but before Commissioner Fredericks came on board, and I had to go up and talk to the people, the concerned citizens up in the 2D area. They were just literally, I mean, deer are everywhere up there. So I mean, this is something that I think we've been working on for a couple of years.
That's not a CWD issue, that's too many deer.
That's just too many. That's what
And I guess
2D is
that's
all
my
about.
last question, and I think I've asked this before, and I've never gotten satisfaction, so I'll ask it again, when it's done.
I'll try better.
Chris, there were a number of farmers here that are complaining about agricultural damage. And the model that you all use, I mean, it looks at forest regeneration, forest health, deer impact on forest. Forest, remember that word. Doesn't say anything about agriculture. And that's what you just mentioned, agricultural damage. I still believe somehow we need to get a measure of agricultural impact into these numbers. And we don't have it. I mean, we just clearly don't have it. We're talking about one guy that shot 150 deer on his farm. I know you say you can't get it, but how could we get it?
Yeah. The way, and we've had this discussion as well, probably now we're going back about a dozen years or so, with habitat management when we started looking for data for the forest measure. And that was a question. It's not just forest habitat out there, there's also the ag side. And in terms of that data set, it didn't exist or doesn't exist. We have a forest data set. That's why we focused on that. But in terms of the ag, a lot of that it comes down to individual tolerance levels of a particular farmer. You know, and in my experience, I've been in some farmers' fields that looked awful, but they were okay with it. You had the same kind of a field, and you talked to the next guy, and he wanted every deer gone. So there's a lot of a tolerance level, so there's more human input when it comes to the ag side. And I think that's where we try to incorporate that in terms of a general survey of the residents of Pennsylvania to get that input in terms of deer-human conflict to sort of capture that ag side. The other thing we do have is we could look at would be our red tag usage in those ag areas. You know, what farmers that are willing to go through those additional hoops to use that program. And if I'm correct, 2D is the top unit in the state right now for red tag harvest and usage. So if that helps with 2D, there is some ag data. You know, if we just relative to the rest of the state, that is one of the units where we see the most use. So our thoughts back years ago was that ag, landscaping, deer vehicle collisions, all of those things we could try and measure, but really that comes down to a human tolerance level, and so we've gone with that survey of people's opinions of deer populations in areas. But yeah, that's is that better than what you've? It's probably the same thing you heard before.
Not really. I mean, we have the vegetable growers here today. We have the farm here. I mean, they're all suffering sometimes considerable damage.
Right.
And then, you know, there's this whole idea about food security, and, you know, if there's deer all through your field, are you gonna be able to sell your crops anymore? It just seems to me that we ought to pay a little more attention than say to the guy, well, you can go deal with red tags and see if you can bring your herd down.
I think one of the options that, and we talked about at the working group, is potentially to try and streamline or improve some of those local programs, the red tag or the DMAP, so that we don't have to, you know, the unit can remain that broad brush, and for the individual farmers to try and make it, you know, a little more efficient from our end as well as their end, and effective as well at that local level. So that's another option, something that I committed to you that we'll work on that.
Any other questions for Chris? All right.
Okay,
That's an easy year.
I'll take it.
Morning, gentlemen. So I'm thrilled to be here not talking about deer. And Chris and I were in a meeting the other week, and he said to me, boy, I saw your email signature. It said pheasant quail biologist. I kind of felt bad for you. And I thought, wow, the deer biologist is feeling bad for me. Maybe I should be concerned a little bit. No, we're here to talk about the Wild Pheasant Recovery Area Program. We're making some recommendations this year to make some changes. At the last commission meeting, I talked to you a little bit about some of our data analysis, trying to get that finished up, which has been a long time coming. And so you have received an electronic copy of our recommendations, and that has a lot more detail in it. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, I'd encourage you to look at that. Has some pretty interesting findings in there that I think are beneficial for moving the program forward, but also learning a lot from what we learned from the research. And so with that, if that's approved, we're hoping to push that out for public consumption as well, because we've got a lot of other states that are looking at Pennsylvania, and a lot of other states are kind of headed in the same direction. They're looking to possibly do pheasant recovery or potential translocation. And again, kind of like with quail, kind of on that cutting edge, we're kind of in front of everybody, so everybody kind of wants to see what we've done. But again, this presentation is primarily, specifically for our recommendations for these 3 remaining recovery areas that we have left. And so I'm just going to run through. The first, I just wanted to mention the goal again is to restore self-sustaining and huntable ringneck pheasant populations in suitable habitats throughout Pennsylvania. I think that's just important to recall as we kind of look through this and some of these recommendations. I also think it's extremely important that we highlight our partnerships, and I try to do this every presentation, but Pheasants Forever staff are the ones that really busted their butts out there on the landscape trying to get habitat on the ground. They're the ones responsible for a lot of that habitat. Those Pheasants Forever chapters that supported these whippers were the ones that really provide a lot of the money for translocation, and even some of these guys are out there on tractors spraying, trying to keep that habitat in place. As well as Penn State Cooperative Unit. They've been huge in helping us analyze some of this data, build some models that have helped us make some decisions moving forward and will help us make decisions into the future. As well as the private landowners, which cannot say enough about private landowners, particularly in a farmland program like this. It's really the private landowners that are crucial in getting that habitat established. So I just wanted to talk quickly about a few of these main takeaways. I think that translates into some of these recommendations as well. The first, 1 out of 12 of these study areas, so we had 4 whippers, each were divided into study areas. 1 out of 12 study areas was a success. The others were not. So if you're a glass half empty kind of person, that doesn't really speak well, although it does speak volumes to the difficulty and the challenges of trying to get pheasants restored in Pennsylvania on such a big scale. But if you're a glass half full kind of person, we have that success. We know what it takes now. We understand kind of that formula for what it takes to get pheasants back in Pennsylvania, and that's extremely important moving forward. And a lot of that speaks to also the reality of private lands management. So private lands are crucial. Almost all of our ag lands are in private land holdings, but it creates a lot of challenges. As most of you are aware, current agricultural practices are not particularly friendly to a lot of these wildlife habitat specialists that rely on farmlands. And that's kind of what we saw with wild pheasants in Pennsylvania prior to this reintroduction effort. But there's also development, which is occurring very quickly in Pennsylvania ag landscapes, and many other factors that are difficult to control. One thing that we learned from that as well is what we would recommend a permanently protected core, and that's kind of what we're doing with the quail program. We've selected public land as our core, and what that does is it kind of pulls a lot of those factors away as far as commodity prices, development, things like that. They kind of rise and fall with the markets and helps protect that habitat long term, and so we think that's pretty important. So if we would move forward with this in the future, or as we move forward with our remaining whippers and recommendations, we think it's important to look into trying to get that. And how do you get that on private lands? One of those ideas is conservation easements, and right now is a good time as there's a lot of land trusts out there working for conservation easements. Another thing to remember is not only pheasants have benefited from this. The amount of grassland bird species that we've seen throughout our surveys is just astounding. Every time we go in to do a flushing survey, it's just amazing at what comes out the other end of that field. Fur bears, other farmland habitat specialists like eastern cottontails, and a lot of generalists like black bear we see come out of these fields, deer, turkeys. So there's a lot of benefit to this long term. And as we think on more of a holistic farmland wildlife approach into the future, I think it's important to remember that. Also, the importance of idle grass. That's really one of the main takeaways for this. You know, we used idle grass. We kind of went into it thinking idle grass was going to be a good substitute for haylands, an area where they could nest but not necessarily use anything else for. But what we found is it's nesting, brood rearing, and a really important part of protective cover throughout the winter. And so idle grass is really what makes up some of these whippers, and really the only good habitat in these recovery areas. This slide I threw up the last time. Really the two whippers that we want to discuss today in detail is the Higgins-Gratz Valley whipper and the Franklin County whipper. These are the two where we didn't see a large success like Central Susquehanna, but we wanted to kind of take a look at them through the eyes of what the research has shown us, and really throw out three options there. Either dissolve it like we did with Somerset County, provide some type of an extension, or possibly a refocus, and like I mentioned, with more of a holistic farmland wildlife approach. So the first is Higgins-Gratz Valley. And this is an area, this one's about 62,000 acres, 36,000 acres. This one has not changed over time, and you can see the boundary there in black. This is in Schuylkill and Dauphin counties. And what we have here is three study areas. We have the Higgins study area on the east side, North Gratz in the northwest, and the South Gratz in the southwest. Some of the things you can see on this map, and let's see if I can get my laser to work. This is really the remaining highest density population that we have remaining. Now, that's not saying that there's not pheasants up here in the Higgins portion, because there is, but they're extremely low density. And we haven't seen a good trend as far as population goes in Higgins there. It's been primarily on a downward trend over time, although we did see a spike here in 2017. It dropped back down in 2018. And so this area, North Gratz, this is basically based around one single farm, about 60 acres. It's in CREP. And unfortunately, that CREP's coming up for re-enrollment here. With the new farm bill, there's going to be a lot of changes, so we're really not sure what direction that's going to head in. But a lot of these areas that were in CREP, we are concerned about with some of the changes. So that's kind of, everybody's trying to figure out that new farm bill yet. This blue shaded area, this is part of the habitat model that we developed with Penn State University. What this is showing is, what we wanted to look at is where in the state are potential areas for habitat, suitable habitat establishment. And what that means is we had to have it below a certain proportion of forest land, within a certain proportion of ag matrix, and below a certain proportion of urban interface. And so we built this model. Again, it's just a model, so these are only estimates. And what we found here is that the majority of this WIPRA doesn't fall into an area where you could have potential suitable habitat. This isn't saying that this is suitable habitat, just that there is potential there in the future. When we look at these population trends here on the right side, in the blue, that's our Higgins, and again, this has been more or less on a downward trend. Our North Gratz is the one that was slightly on an increasing trend, but has kind of stabilized or flattened out, somewhat downward. And then our South Gratz has always been at a very, very low level, almost to zero on several occasions. Because of that, we're recommending that we dissolve the Higgins-Gratz WIPRA, recommending that it be opened back up to propagated pheasant stocking and pheasant hunting as well. Dog training restrictions be dropped and be opened up just like every other area in the state. So Franklin County, moving on. This is one of our larger WIPRAs. This one was around 62,000. It currently is. That black border is the current WIPRA size. This area, you can see, again, those potential habitat circles actually covers up a good portion of that. So we feel that it was probably placed in a fairly good area, and we feel it has a lot of potential there. Keep in mind that this area had the lowest stocking rate when we first started. This was at the tail end of The translocation was when pheasants started to dry up in the Midwest, and since then, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get any birds over time to complete the translocation process here. Despite that, what we see in our population estimate, last year we saw a little bit of a downturn, but overall, if you fit a trend line to this, we see an increasing trend line. And that's pretty surprising in this heavily agricultural landscape here. And again, with such a low stocking rate, those very few birds are actually slowly increasing with very little input. You can also see here that these birds are spread out over several farms. This area is approximately 800 acres where we have our highest densities. We do also have pheasants probably scattered throughout here, different times of the year, but our highest densities are obviously right here in the red. And the one good thing with Franklin County is we have one farm there that we do consider more of a core protected area. This is a farmer that has basically dedicated his farm strictly to pheasants. It's not in CREP, so it's not kind of up to the whims of how the farm bill changes or things like that. And he's also not concerned about commodity prices and things like that as well. So with that, we feel that Franklin County, where it's located, we're going to recommend that we shrink this border down to this red area. That shrinks it down to about 19,000 acres. We base that off the dispersal distance of pheasants, which is approximately 2 miles, and 19,000 acres is also the same amount as what we have in Washingtonville West study area. So we feel it's a good-sized area to manage for pheasants and really focus efforts in as far as habitat. By shrinking this down, we would recommend that the rest of this be opened up to propagated pheasant stocking, as well as pheasant hunting. Obviously, dog training restrictions be lifted here, but we're also recommending for this year that dog training restrictions be lifted within this WIPRA and within the Central Susquehanna WIPRA. That was set up primarily to help pheasants get established over time, particularly in those first couple years of stocking. Now that we have established populations, it's not that much of a concern. Also, without propagated bird releases there and being in private hands, we feel that that'll be highly regulated by private landowners. And again, without propagated pheasant releases there shouldn't be a lot of dog training occurring on those properties in particularly. It should be noted that this is also about 13 miles south of the Letterkenny bobwhite quail focus area. And so we see, again, as that we look into more of a holistic approach into the future as far as these farmland species, this may be a great area to focus on over time with some of our habitat programs through the Bureau of Wildlife Habitat Management. We would recommend that we keep the pheasant hunting restriction as well as the propagated pheasant restriction within that red area. Central Susquehanna, it's our last one. It's kind of difficult to see, but in this gray area, this was actually our original border. That's about 97,000 acres. This was our largest WIPRA. 2017, we took 2016's data, and we used this heat mapping to kind of determine where our existing populations, where our highest densities were. And that's how we redrew this. You see you have the red line, which is our proposed for this year, but you also have this panhandle coming off the southeast. It's because we had a population up in here. Fortunately, that has winked out since 2016. So what we're doing is recommending that we focus on this area, which has always primarily been our strongest and highest density. This is obviously where we do our youth hunts. We've got some absolutely wonderful habitat within here remaining. You can also see from our potential habitat model, it fits very nicely within this area here. So we feel that that is helping to justify that as well. And so this area is actually going to be shrunk down to about 31,000 acres now, which is probably a little more appropriate as we focus on not just increasing habitat, but just stabilizing any kind of habitat loss there as enrollment comes back up with a lot of these farms. Again, we're recommending continue to keep those hunting restrictions in there for pheasants, continue to keep the propagated bird restrictions in there as well, but also recommending to drop the dog training restrictions within Central Susquehanna for the reasons I had mentioned earlier. when you look at population trends over time, the orange is actually since 2017, since we've made this switch to the smaller area. That's all we can kind of track from our survey points in there. But you see fairly stabilized trend there at around 700 birds. When you look at our blue line, this is our Washingtonville West study area. That was the only one that was still encompassed within that new area. So fortunately, we'd be able to continue to track that over time. And that one, although we did see a dip in 2015 as some farms came out, we've seen that slowly increasing to stabilized. So we're very happy with those numbers. So just to kind of recap, we're recommending to dissolve the Higgins-Gratz WIPRA, recommending that the Franklin County WIPRA is reduced in size, and then we're going to be working very closely with John Tauscher and Bureau of Habitat Management on trying to revamp our deferred use of grasslands program, trying to get some specific bodies into some of these new WIPRAs and really make a good push at trying to increase habitat there. And then also reducing the Central Susquehanna WIPRA size. Again, just trying to get that habitat back in there and exponentially growing. And then also continue the hunting. We'd like to continue the hunting this year again with the youth hunt. And then we'd also like to look into possibly expanding that here into the future beyond just youth. But that's something we need to talk with landowners about and sit down to see how that would translate. Again, we'd like to remove those dog training restrictions, but keep other restrictions in place at this point. So with that, if you have any questions or concerns or comments, I'd be happy to field those.
Commissioner Hoover.
I have a couple of questions for you. Since we've revamped the pheasant stocking program and we're focusing on our game lands,
Sure.
why would we put at risk the work that we've done setting up the pheasant program, the restocking program that we have? We're not going to overstock that area anyway. Why would we open it up to let them take out the wild pheasant that we have left?
So there aren't very many, and again, if you remember, the importance was to be able to hunt them. So you need to have them at a higher density to be able to hunt. So we're hoping with Franklin County that we reach that. But when we open some of these areas up, Central Susquehanna is kind of a good idea, a good example. Try to get back to that here. And so here in the PP&L area, my laser's not working now, but this area to the right there, we still have very low densities of birds there. But we also don't want to take away the potential to, we do hear that from hunters is, I can't hunt there anymore. And PP&L at that time was still open to hunting, and some of those areas may still be, although a lot of that's private sale now. And so what we want to try to do is reduce it to where we have our highest population densities without also restricting the ability for hunters to be able to hunt propagated birds.
Well, I understand that, but if we look at the state game land, there's no state game lands in that area. Seems to be there's one up to the right.
Yes, sir.
But we're not overstocking farm birds in that area, so it doesn't change it. And we're literally talking 30 to 35,000 hunters statewide.
Sure.
I would hate to see us throw away the work that we've done and destroy the possibility of those birds actually surviving and growing out from the areas that they're in. I'm really against I get what you're trying to do,
Sure.
but we're not going to stock birds over top of them anyway. I'm not sure why we would make them fair game.
Sure. I think it's just, again, just restricting people's use of that area. And with very low densities, what we've seen, particularly in these other areas, is we've seen population trends going down. It's kind of like Somerset. What we saw there was just a continual decline. It's almost zero. So at what point is it worth trying to save a few wild pheasants there while you're restricting folks' ability to...
Look at what we're doing for quail.
Sure.
At what point do we say enough's enough? I mean, we're out there now we're talking about spending millions of dollars
Sure.
to try to bring quail back to the state of Pennsylvania, wild quail back to the state of Pennsylvania. So it has to be one or the other. It can't be both.
And I feel like with quail, that's a native species that we allowed to slip out the back door, and that's kind of our primary driving force is to bring back an extirpated native species. Whereas pheasants, it's not a native species. It is obviously an important species for hunters. And so I think that's the difference there, if that makes any sense.
I think the bigger question, and I think it was actually asked in the report you sent to us, but we didn't get it until really late, so.
Sure.
But I think the question there was, and if I recall, it says something to the, let's see, where does it say? Essentially, you have to have a huntable population. So if you go back to this, it says restore a self-sustaining and a huntable population. And I think you decided in Franklin County, and I think rightfully so, even though it's not a huntable population, is it a sustainable population? If we're gonna spend money 13 miles to the north to get not a hunting population, but a sustainable population, I think that's what really has to be the measure. I mean, not whether or not it's huntable or not. If it's a sustainable, we can say we have pheasants here, they hold over year after year after year. So, I'm all for keeping, the Franklin, whether we shrink it or whether we don't, I still think we need to do that.
Okay.
And I guess that gets back to your question then too, Brian, is to, what is really the goal? Is it that we have to have a huntable population? And would it be sustainable outside of that shrunken area in the central Susquehanna, even if it weren't huntable? And I guess the last thing is, Brian's talking about dilution of, this wild population. And I don't know if that's true, man. Even in the Northwest, where we get pretty bad winters, we still get some holdover from stock birds year after year. I'm sure that probably happens everywhere. So is that really a dilution in the first place? I mean, that's what I think your assumption is that we're somehow diluting these birds that we brought in from wherever they were, the Dakotas, or I forget where they came from.
Sure.
But so can you answer that? And do we really want to change the focus back to sustainable versus huntable?
Sure. Yeah, so there's not a lot of genetic work out there, but there is some that shows that when you continue to stock over top of a wild population, you start to see a dilution of genetics there. So, we do believe that is part of why we lost pheasants in the first place. More so the habitat loss, I think, is what really it points to. But I guess that question then goes back to, are we just trying to bring pheasants back to have pheasants? Are we trying to bring them back to hunt pheasants? And the reason we're keeping Franklin is we believe that we can bring them back to a huntable population there. We're not just trying to have pheasants to have pheasants. And again, that was kind of laid out in the original plan, was for a huntable population. And obviously that's like why we're closing Higgins Gratz, why we closed Somerset. Those populations aren't showing sustainability. And so, but Franklin County is, and we feel if we can put some more into that, we can bring that up to a huntable population.
But what if you did? It's still not a bad thing.
It depends who you talk to, I suppose, but yeah. So I think that's just kind of going back to the plan, is it was for hunting, and again, being a non-native species, but an important game bird, that was the whole purpose behind that. And so if, when we rewrite a plan, if that would want to change, we could change that. But at this point, I do feel that, with ringneck pheasants, it needs to be at a huntable population to make it valuable.
But the other variable that we're not talking about is landowner participation too.
Sure.
I mean, when you started the whippers, and I was all in on the whippers when we first got here, everybody's the same, right? We're all in. Well, then as the CREP funding changes, landowners are forced to do other things with their land. You kind of drop off in their excitement too.
Sure.
So I mean, we're also stuck with that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Especially with the pheasant population. Even with the quail population, we have a little bit more control over that. But with pheasants, not so much.
Sure. And that's what we're looking at, again, with John Tauscher and the Bureau of Wildlife Management. We're trying to work with Pheasants Forever to see, okay, it worked really well in the beginning, but it's not working so well now. So what do we need to do to change that? And is that, we need to increase rental rates, we need to offer other incentives. And so that's kind of what we're trying to decide now, is how can we do that to start to increase acreage again? Does it need to be short-term set-asides? It's hard to take your ground out for 10 to 15 years, not knowing what commodity prices are going to do. So, and we had our boom in the late 60s, 70s. It was short-term set-asides that drove that. So, I mean, those are some of the things that we're trying to discuss, talk about, and see how we can change. now's the time. With a brand-new farm bill, with a new VEPA HIP grant, now's the time to be able to kind of make some changes and go from there. So we're excited about that.
Anybody else? Great, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Okay. Everybody.